Okay, so when I was in lessons, or even now when I'm in lectures, it wasn't uncommon for me to essentially not entirely understand everything or follow along the entire time through the lecture. So whether that was being distracted by something or simply confused, etc., whatever it may be. But by the time the lesson ends, there's always this kind of thing that you do, and it's to make like almost a mental note of, okay, I didn't really follow along in that lesson very well, so I need to go back and essentially reteach myself the contents of that lesson that I just did. So what I'm about to say might sound controversial, but that mode of thinking almost is actually incredibly dangerous and is not very useful to you. What you should do instead is almost just kind of ignore the fact that you don't really understand that thing. Rather than thinking, I'm gonna go back and reteach myself how to do X topic that I just learned in lesson, what you should do instead is basically just tank it and keep going. And this sounds kind of counterintuitive right now, but I'm gonna explain in some more depth why that is the case. So why should you do that? Okay, well, there's firstly the obvious psychological reason, I suppose, that you probably never go back to that topic anyway. What that means is there's kind of a mental build-up. Every lesson that you don't 100% engage with, which is inevitably going to happen, by the way, but every time that does happen, you kind of add one more to the backlog of things you need to do but aren't actually doing. So, and most people don't even make actual notes of this, and even if they do, they're usually not very helpful because you'll just have a list of topics. You know, that doesn't actually help you to be able to understand them or even motivate you to go back to them later and do them in more depth to try and understand them. So there's that. And even when you do try to go back to a specific topic and try and relearn it, one of two things happens. Either you still don't understand it because you were confused by it to begin with, why wouldn't you be confused by it the second time around? Or you understand most of it, so you think to yourself, this isn't what confused me in lesson, what's going on here? Like, I can read all of this and this is all fine, but I was confused in lesson, so what's going on here? So that's the psychological angle, but even more so than that, more detrimental than that is, and this is what I really want you to understand and take away from this video, is that your perception of what you are confused by versus not confused by is actually really bad. So your kind of intuition of being confused by a certain thing is often very vague and very general. So if I were to ask you, let's say you just had a lesson on integration, and I said to you, and you told me, I don't really understand integration. It's like I'm kind of confused by it. I'm going to go back and look at the chapter later in my own time to try and understand it better. And I told you, okay, that's fine. And I gave you a question, a specific integration question, and you told me, no, that's fine. I can do that. It's this other thing that I'm confused by. It's it's integration using trig or something like that. I give you another question and you say, oh, no, it's not that which I can't do. It's this specific question in integration using trig methods. You see here how you thought originally that the term you had in your mind for the confusion was just integration. And that's extremely vague and extremely broad. And then I've narrowed it down by simply asking you to do questions on integration, something that you claimed to me that was confusing you. And the point of this is that your feeling of confusion is too vague, too broad, and too inaccurate to actually be useful to do anything with. And that's also why when you do go back to relearning, like we said before, you may find yourself in the scenario where you look at the chapter again and there's nothing that actually confuses you, or you can't even pinpoint what it is that was confusing to you in the lesson, because when you read the notes or you read the online resources, you're going through it and there's no issue. Now, luckily for you, the solution for this is extremely simple, because now that we've identified, and if we've correctly identified that the problem with your confusion is that it's too it's too vague and too inaccurate to be able to do anything practical with, then we simply need to address that issue, and that solves the problem. So how do we address that issue? Well, that brings me back to the start of the video where I said you should almost ignore that feeling of confusion and that urge to want to go back and reread a specific topic or look through your notes again. So what should you do instead? You should continue with the mindset that anything that you've theoretically covered in lesson, right? If your teacher has spoken to you about it, you should assume that you understood it 100%. Even if you didn't, you should assume that you did. And what does this do? So once you assume that anything you've covered in lesson should be is understood 100%, that allows you to see what kinds of questions you are able to do. Doing actual questions for each chapter or entire past papers if you're able to, based on what you have covered in lesson, because there's no point in doing something you literally haven't covered. You're just not going to understand it. But that's why you should treat everything you do in lesson as if you did understand it fully, because that means you can attempt at least every question that has been covered by your teacher. And now, once you do attempt these questions, and you should do these questions with proper technique, and what I mean by that more specifically, you can see if you just go to my channel and you check out some of the rest of my videos, what specifically I mean by that. So I talk about deep focused 1 to 2 hour sessions, and always practicing exam technique and not studying with your phone, etc., etc. I talk about that in other videos. That's not the purpose of this one, but the point is that when you're doing these questions and you're doing these questions properly, you should be making records or collecting data, essentially. You're collecting as much hard data about every question or every paper that you do in some kind of document or even a piece of paper. It doesn't need to be extremely, sophisticated. It could literally be you just writing pen and paper. But the point is that you collect data on everything that you actually are doing, and then it becomes far more clear to see what actually is confusing you and what you thought was confusing you, but actually you were able to do it when the question showed up, or that the topic was so niche that it wasn't even worth going back and looking at because the question didn't come up. Now, by collecting this data, you have actual hard evidence, and you've turned what was once an intuition into something that's actionable and something where you can clearly see patterns emerge. For example, if you genuinely don't understand how to do a specific type of integration question, you will see that come up where you lose marks on this thing repeatedly. Or if there's something you understand quite well, you'll see that you repeatedly pick up more marks on that thing. And now the only kind of bonus step, almost, if you will, is knowing specifically what to do with the questions and the subtopics that you've now actually gathered from hard data that you aren't as good at or you're confused in. And that's going to be the topic of my next video. So if you would like to learn in more detail what you should do in that situation, then make sure to subscribe and stay tuned so that you're notified when I do upload that video and you can take something from it. But that's all I have to say for today. I hope you took something useful from that. Thank you and have a nice day.